The morning was like any other in the quiet town, but for one young girl, it was the start of a nightmare she could never have imagined. Her world, once full of innocence and laughter, was about to be shattered by a moment of cruelty she would never forget. It started when she was walking home from school, the sun shining down, casting long shadows on the sidewalk. She had no idea what was waiting for her. She didn't know that the day would change her life forever. No one could have predicted that a simple walk would lead to a confrontation with someone who, on any other day, would have been seen as a figure of authority, a protector. Instead, the man in uniform would become the source of her suffering. It was the middle of the afternoon when the police officer pulled over. The car's tires screeched as it came to a sudden stop, blocking her path. The young girl stood there, confused, her heart racing. She hadn't done anything wrong. She was just walking home, minding her own business, when the officer stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning her every move with suspicion. There was no reason for her to feel fear, not until he spoke. "You," he barked, his voice sharp and cold. "What are you doing here?" Her stomach twisted as she stammered a reply, trying to explain that she was just heading home. But the officer wasn't listening. His gaze was fixed on her, as if she was some sort of threat. He began asking questions that didn't make sense, and as the minutes stretched on, the tension in the air grew thicker. She could feel the heat rising in her cheeks, the shame creeping in. She couldn't understand why this was happening. Then, something happened that made her blood run cold. The officer, his face contorted with anger, grabbed her by the arm and yanked her towards the car. She tried to pull away, but he was too strong. Her body shook with fear, and her mind raced. What was he doing? Why was he treating her like this? And why was no one around to help her? Without warning, the officer reached for the girl's hair. She screamed in shock, trying to protect herself, but it was no use. The officer wasn't listening. His hands were rough as they yanked at her hair, pulling it free from its neat braids. The girl's hair fell to the ground in a heap, leaving her feeling exposed, vulnerable, humiliated. The officer stood over her, a cruel smile spreading across his face. "You don't belong here," he muttered, his voice dripping with disdain. "You don't belong in this neighborhood." The young girl's heart shattered as the officer continued to mock her, laughing at her helplessness. But what the officer didn't know was that he had just made a grave mistake. He had no idea who she really was or who her family was. He had no idea what kind of people they were. If he had, he would never have dared to lay a hand on her. As the officer stepped back, proud of his cruel act, the young girl wiped away her tears. But deep inside, a fire was starting to grow. It was the kind of fire that comes from being wrong, the kind that can't be extinguished until justice is served. She knew that she couldn't let this moment define her, but she also knew that she wasn't going to let it go. There was someone out there, someone powerful, who would make sure the officer paid for what he had done. The girl's mind raced as she looked up at the officer, who had turned away, smug in his victory. He had no idea what was coming. He didn't know that the people he had crossed had the power to change everything. They would show him what happens when you make the wrong enemy. But first, they would have to find out who had hurt their loved one. The young girl's father was no ordinary man. He wasn't someone who could be easily intimidated. He was someone who had fought against the odds his entire life, someone who would stop at nothing to protect his family. He had built his name in a world that had tried to tear him down, and now, he would do whatever it took to make sure the officer paid for what he had done. But he couldn't act just yet. Not until he knew who was responsible for his daughter's suffering. He had to find out how far the corruption had spread, and who in their right mind would go so far as to harm a young girl. But he wasn't going to wait long. He would soon make his move, and when he did, nothing would stop him. As the officer walked away, unaware of the storm brewing in the background, the young girl wiped away her final tear. She knew that everything was about to change. The story of the officer's cruelty had only just begun, and when the truth came to light, it would shake the foundations of everything they thought they knew. The girl's father was a man who had lived through hard times, who had seen his share of injustice. He had always fought back, always stood his ground, and he wasn't about to let this go unnoticed. What the officer didn't realize was that the moment he hurt this girl, he had unknowingly signed his own fate. But the question remained, how long would it take for the truth to come out? Would the officer realize his mistake before it was too late? Or would he, like so many others before him, find himself caught in a web of consequences far beyond his comprehension? One thing was certain. The story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. And now, as the young girl stood there, looking at her reflection in the shop window across the street, she made a vow. She would never let herself be the victim again. She wouldn't let anyone ever make her feel small, not ever again. And when the time came, when everything was set in motion, she would be ready. She would stand tall, and she would make sure the world knew who she truly was. But for now, she simply turned away from the officer's car, walking slowly towards home, her mind filled with thoughts of the future. What would happen next? How would it all unfold? It was the beginning of a journey, one filled with pain, but also with the kind of strength only those who had been wronged could possess. And when the time came, the officer would learn the hard way what it meant to mess with the wrong family. But the question was, would it be too late for him to make things right? Would he realize the gravity of his actions before the consequences arrived? The only thing certain was that there was no turning back. The wheels of justice were already in motion, and soon, the officer would have no choice but to face the truth. But by then, would it be too late for him to escape the consequences of his actions? Only time would tell. And that was the greatest mystery of all. The days after the incident moved slowly for the young girl, each one stretching longer than the last. She kept to herself, staying quiet, avoiding the stares and whispers that seemed to follow her every step. It wasn't just the humiliation of having her hair shaved off that haunted her, it was the feeling of helplessness, the way she had been treated as if she didn't matter, as if her pain didn't exist. She couldn't shake the images of that officer's face, twisted with cruelty as he laughed, standing over her like a predator. But deep inside, a fire had ignited. It wasn't just anger, it was determination. She wasn't going to let this go, not without a fight. The officer's actions weren't just a random act of cruelty, they were part of something much bigger, a pattern that ran deep in the town's system, a network of corruption and injustice that couldn't be ignored. She had always known the world wasn't perfect, but now, she saw it more clearly than ever before. Her father had always warned her about the way things worked in their world. He'd taught her that nothing came easily, that the truth was often buried beneath layers of lies and deceit. He was a man who had fought for what he had, someone who had earned every ounce of respect he received. But he also knew that there were battles worth fighting, and then there were battles that could destroy everything you'd worked for. And he had taught her to pick her battles carefully, to know when to stand her ground and when to walk away. But this was different. The officer had crossed the line, and she knew her father wouldn't let it go. There was no walking away from this kind of wrong. No matter how hard he tried to protect her, no matter how much he wanted to shield her from the harshness of the world, this time, he couldn't. She was his daughter. And no one was going to hurt her and get away with it. The girl's father was a man who had built his life from nothing. He'd grown up in a neighborhood where opportunity was scarce, where people had to fight for every inch of progress they made. But he had done it. He had risen above the circumstances that had tried to define him. His name had become known, respected, feared. People in the community knew better than to cross him. He had spent years climbing to the top of the game, learning the ins and outs of the system, and using it to his advantage. He didn't make enemies unless they forced him to. But now, he had one more enemy to deal with. And this one was different. This was personal. When the girl came home that afternoon, tears still fresh on her cheeks. Her father immediately saw the pain in her eyes. She tried to hide it, to pretend everything was fine, but he knew her too well. He could see through her mask of silence. "Talk to me," he said gently, his voice firm but caring. She didn't answer at first, staring at the floor, her thoughts trapped somewhere far away. He waited patiently, giving her the space she needed to gather her thoughts. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she spoke. "Daddy?" "There was an officer. He hurt me," she whispered, her voice trembling. Her father's heart sank, but he kept his composure. He had known something wasn't right when she had come home that day. He had seen the way she was walking, the way she avoided his eyes. But hearing it from her lips made it all too real. "Tell me everything," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She took a deep breath and began to recount everything that had happened, from the moment the officer had stopped her on the street to the cruel actions that followed. She told him about the humiliation, about the feeling of powerlessness, about the officer's harsh words, and the way he had grabbed her hair, pulling it free from its braids as though she was nothing more than an object to be controlled. As she spoke, her father's jaw tightened. His fists clenched at his sides, the anger building inside him like a storm. But even more than that, there was a sense of fear. He feared for his daughter's safety. He feared for the future of a town that seemed to have forgotten what it meant to care for its people. He knew the system was broken, but he never thought it would touch his family. Now the cracks were visible, and the damage was clear. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" his daughter asked, her voice barely audible. He paused for a moment, looking at her. "No, I'm not. This isn't just about you. This is about every person who's ever been wronged by the system, every person who's been left behind, forgotten. We won't let them keep doing this." But as determined as he was to make things right, he knew there was a long road ahead. He couldn't just walk into the police station and demand justice. He couldn't force the town to face its own darkness without first understanding who was behind it. He needed to know how deep the corruption ran, who was pulling the strings, and who else might be involved. The officer who had hurt his daughter was just a pawn in a much bigger game. He was a small part of a broken system, and the real question was who was in charge of it all. Who had allowed this to happen? Who had given this officer the power to treat people as though they were beneath him? He couldn't make any moves just yet. Not until he had answers. Not until he understood who his real enemies were. He sat down at the kitchen table, his mind racing. There was too much to consider. He had always been a man of action, someone who didn't wait for things to happen but made them happen. But this time, it was different. This wasn't just about muscle or influence, this was about something deeper, something that could bring down everything he had worked for. And yet he couldn't back down now. His daughter's pain would not be in vain. He didn't know it yet, but the officer's mistake would soon lead to a chain of events that no one in this town would be able to escape. The officer had no idea who he had crossed, or what kind of people were watching him. But he would soon find out. The girl, still trying to process everything, knew that this wasn't the end. She could feel the weight of her father's promise, the determination in his voice. He wasn't going to let this go. But she also knew that their world would change because of this moment. Their lives would never be the same again. The officer had made an enemy out of the wrong family, and soon, he would understand just how much he had underestimated them. For now, though, all they could do was wait. The tension in the house was thick, hanging in the air like a storm that hadn't yet broken. But when it did, it would be impossible to stop. The officer had no idea what was coming for him. And neither did anyone else. As the sun set that night, casting a long shadow over the quiet town, the girl and her father sat in silence. They both knew that the coming days would bring answers and consequences. But neither of them could predict just how far-reaching those consequences would be. The story wasn't over yet. It had only just begun. And no one would walk away from it unscathed. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of justice. The young girl went about her life, but the scars from that day lingered, even in the most mundane moments. It wasn't just about her hair anymore, it was about everything that had been taken from her in that moment: her dignity, her sense of safety, her place in the world. Every time she looked in the mirror, the reflection seemed different, unfamiliar. And the more she thought about it, the more the pieces started to fall into place. The officer hadn't just attacked her, he had made a statement about how little he thought of her, how small and powerless he believed she was. But the officer had made a mistake. Her father's silence spoke volumes, but she could feel the pressure building within him, like a dam on the verge of breaking. She knew he was preparing, watching, waiting. She also knew he wasn't the kind of man who could be content with just silence, just standing by. Not when something so important was at stake. The town, meanwhile, had begun to settle back into its routine. The officer who had done the unthinkable was still going about his days, none the wiser to the storm that was brewing beneath the surface. People around town murmured about what had happened, but those who held real power, the ones who mattered, were more concerned with maintaining their grip on control than with righting the wrong. They never thought anyone would dare challenge them. After all, the officer was just one of many, and those who held the keys to the town's future were far more dangerous. They were untouchable, or so they believed. But they didn't know what was coming. The girl's father wasn't going to wait for the system to fix itself. He had been gathering information, reaching out to people in places where others didn't dare go. He was learning things he wasn't supposed to know, things that were hidden deep in the town's underbelly. Corruption, deceit, and the silent agreement among the powerful to ignore the cries of the powerless, it was all coming to light, piece by piece. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, he sat at the kitchen table, staring at a file. It wasn't the first time he'd been through it. He knew every word, every piece of evidence by heart. But this time, there was something different. This time, the puzzle was almost complete. The officer who had humiliated his daughter was just a small part of a larger plan, one that reached deep into the heart of the community. The officer wasn't just acting on his own, wasn't just a rogue agent of cruelty, he was a cog in a machine designed to keep people like them in their place. And that machine was about to be dismantled. The girl, now sitting beside her father, looked at him, her expression one of both fear and hope. She had seen the transformation in him over the past few weeks, the quiet resolve, the way he held his anger like a weapon, ready to strike when the time was right. She knew this wasn't just about her anymore, it was about something much bigger. She could feel the tension building between them, the weight of what was coming. It was all going to change, and neither of them was prepared for the consequences. Her father put the file down and looked at her, his face hard but his eyes soft. "We're going to make this right," he said, his voice steady. "But you need to be ready for what's coming." The girl nodded, her heart racing. She wasn't sure if she was ready, but she knew there was no turning back. What happened next could change everything. And then, one fateful afternoon, everything finally collided. The officer, oblivious to the storm closing in around him, went about his usual routine. But things weren't as they seemed. There were whispers on the street, strange glances exchanged, and a strange tension in the air. No one knew exactly what was going to happen, but everyone could feel that something was brewing, something big. The girl's father had finally put his plan into motion. He had reached out to the right people, gathered the right allies, and set the pieces in place. It was only a matter of time before everything would unfold. The officer arrived at work that day like any other. He didn't know it yet, but his life was about to change forever. His arrogance had made him blind to the power that others held, to the connections and forces that worked behind the scenes. He had made the mistake of thinking that no one could touch him, that he was untouchable. But the truth was that he had underestimated one thing: the power of a father protecting his child. As the day wore on, the officer went about his business, unaware that he was being watched. And all the while, the girl and her father waited. They knew the time was coming. They could feel it, like the quiet before a storm. Every moment stretched out, every second carrying the weight of the unknown. They couldn't predict how the officer would react when the truth was revealed, or what his next move would be. But they knew it would be intense, and it would be nothing like he expected. The girl's father had spent weeks preparing for this moment. He had already confronted the people who held the town's power, making it clear that he knew what they had done, what they had allowed. He had already begun to stir the pot, making the connections he needed to make. But the officer, he was the one who needed to be exposed. He was the key. And once he fell, the whole system would come crumbling down. That afternoon, as the officer sat in his office, reviewing paperwork, he had no idea that his world was about to shatter. The door opened, and the girl's father walked in. He was calm, collected, his presence filling the room. The officer looked up, confused at the unexpected visitor. The air was thick with tension, as if the entire room held its breath, waiting for something to happen. "I think it's time we talked," the girl's father said, his voice low and controlled. The officer, still trying to keep his composure, stood up, his hands instinctively reaching for his weapon. "What do you want?" he asked, his voice shaky, his eyes darting around the room. "Justice," the girl's father replied, a cold fire burning in his eyes. "And an explanation for what happened to my daughter." For a moment, everything seemed to freeze. The officer's expression flickered, uncertainty crossing his face. He had no idea how to respond. He thought he could intimidate the man in front of him, that he could make him back down with a few threatening words. But he was wrong. The girl's father stepped closer, every movement precise, calculated. He didn't speak again, he didn't need to. His very presence demanded respect, and the officer could feel it now, like a weight pressing down on his chest. The room was silent, save for the soft sound of the officer's breathing, growing more frantic by the second. He had no idea who this man was, but he could feel the danger in the air, the unmistakable sense that something was about to happen, something that could ruin him. And then, just as the officer opened his mouth to say something, the door slammed open. The girl walked in, her eyes locked on the officer's, burning with a mix of defiance and determination. She stepped forward, standing by her father's side. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" she said, her voice steady, her gaze unwavering. "You thought no one would care. But we're here to show you that you were wrong." And in that moment, everything changed. The officer, for the first time, understood the gravity of the situation. He wasn't facing just any family. He was facing the very people who could destroy him, expose him for everything he was, and bring the system to its knees. And it was too late to stop it now. The pieces were in motion. The storm had arrived, and there was no escaping it. The officer stood frozen, his eyes darting between the girl and her father, trying to comprehend what was happening. The weight of the moment settled in like an invisible chain, and for the first time, the officer began to feel something he hadn't felt in years: fear. His instinct to intimidate, to control the situation, faltered as the girl's gaze burned into him. She wasn't just some vulnerable teenager anymore. No, she had become something far more dangerous, someone who had been wronged and was now seeking the kind of justice that didn't rely on the laws of the land. "I've heard whispers," the girl's father said calmly, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "You thought you could ruin my daughter, but the truth is much darker than you realize." His words hung in the air, each one a deliberate strike. The officer's hands twitched, as if he wanted to reach for something, anything, to regain control. "I don't know what you're talking about," the officer stammered, though his voice trembled with the weight of the lie. It was clear to him now that this wasn't just a father seeking revenge. This wasn't even just about the girl. There was something else happening, something deeper, and he had a sinking feeling that he was in over his head. But the girl wasn't finished. You think you're the only one with power? She asked, her tone sharp, full of conviction. I've learned a lot in these past weeks. I've talked to the people you've hurt, the ones you've silenced. They don't fear you anymore. The officer's confusion grew. He had thought this was just about him and his abuse of power, but now it felt like the walls were closing in on him from all sides. He was trapped, and the realization made his stomach churn. He had underestimated them, underestimated her. But just as he opened his mouth to try and defend himself, something unexpected happened. The door to the office slammed open with a force that shook the walls. The officer's head snapped toward the sound, heart racing. Standing in the doorway was someone he had never expected to see, someone he had assumed was nothing more than a rumor. It was a man, but not just any man. He was dressed in a dark, well-tailored suit, and his eyes were sharp, calculating. The tension in the room immediately thickened, and the girl's father straightened, his expression unreadable. Don't worry, the newcomer said, his voice smooth and confident. You're not alone in this. The officer blinked, his mind scrambling to catch up. Who the hell are you? He demanded, though his voice trembled. The man smiled, a cold, knowing smile. Let's just say I've been watching this little drama unfold from the shadows. And now it's time to take the next step. Before the officer could respond, the newcomer walked into the room, his gaze never leaving the girl or her father. The air grew thick with uncertainty as the man stopped directly in front of the girl's father, studying him with a look that spoke volumes. Then, with a swift motion, he extended his hand. You've been looking for answers, haven't you? I can give them to you. But in return, you'll have to work with me. The girl's father hesitated, his instincts screaming at him to walk away. But something in the man's eyes told him that this wasn't just another empty offer. He could feel the pull of something greater, something that could shift the entire dynamic of what was happening. But the girl, standing beside her father, wasn't fooled. She had grown too strong, too aware of the danger in the world. What do you want from us? She asked, her voice hard as steel. You think we'll just accept whatever deal you're offering? The man chuckled, but there was no warmth in it. No, of course not. I know your father won't just fall for this. But what I'm offering is bigger than any of us. It's about power that none of us can get on our own. And the officer? He glanced at the officer, who was now visibly shaking. He's just the beginning. The officer's face strained of color. He had no idea what was happening, what these people were talking about, but he knew one thing: he was no longer in control. The situation had spiraled beyond anything he could have anticipated. You see, the man continued, walking slowly around the room, I've been watching this town for a long time. I know every dark secret, every corrupt deal, every hidden truth. And I know exactly how to use them. You've been trying to take down the officer because of what he did to your daughter, but that's small potatoes compared to the larger game we're playing. The girl's father remained silent, his gaze unwavering, while the girl stepped closer to him, her body tense. She could feel the danger in the room. It was like a predator circling its prey, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. What game are you talking about? The girl's father asked, his voice steady but edged with suspicion. The man smirked, the flicker of something dangerous in his eyes. The game that will bring everything down. It's bigger than the officer. Bigger than you. It's about who controls this town, who pulls the strings behind the scenes, and who profits from the darkness. And I'm here to make sure that you're on the winning side. The officer, still struggling to comprehend what was happening, blurted out, I'm not involved in any of this. I'm just doing my job. I didn't. The man held up a hand, silencing him. Oh, you're involved, all right. You've been a tool, a pawn in a much bigger scheme. And now it's time for you to face the consequences. The officer's face twisted with confusion and fear. No, no, this can't be happening. I didn't know. The man's eyes glinted, a predatory look in them. That's the thing. None of you ever know what's really happening until it's too late. And now? Well, now you'll learn the price of ignorance. The tension in the room grew unbearable. The girl's father stood still, his expression calculating as he watched the officer crumble before him. The officer had thought he was untouchable, that his actions had no real consequences. But now he was trapped in a web of lies, surrounded by people whose power reached far beyond what he had ever imagined. The girl's father turned his gaze back to the mysterious man in the suit, his mind racing. There were far too many pieces to this puzzle, and the stakes were higher than he had ever anticipated. If he accepted this man's offer, what would he be getting himself into? And if he refused, what would happen to his daughter and to everything he had fought for? The man smiled again, sensing the hesitation. You don't have to decide now, he said, his voice smooth as velvet. But you'll have to choose soon. The clock is ticking, and the officer is only the beginning of a much larger problem. And just like that, the stakes had risen. The officer was no longer just an obstacle, he was a pawn in a far greater game, one that threatened to destroy everything in its path. The girl's father stood at the edge of a precipice, torn between the choice of joining forces with a dangerous player in this game, or continuing the fight alone, knowing full well that every decision he made would have far-reaching consequences. The girl looked up at her father, her eyes searching his face for answers. But he had none. Not yet. And as the tension in the room reached its peak, one thing was clear: the battle for justice was far from over. It had only just begun. The air in the room seemed to thicken with every passing second, the tension palpable as the officer stood there, his knees almost buckling under the weight of the truth dawning on him. The man in the suit, who had been watching the scene unfold with a predatory smile, stepped closer, his eyes glinting with a sense of finality. The officer's mind raced. How had it come to this? How had he become nothing more than a pawn in a game so much bigger than he ever imagined? The girl's father, meanwhile, stood still, his thoughts swirling in the chaos of the moment. He had come so far, his anger had driven him to take down the officer who had wronged his daughter, but now he was being offered something he couldn't quite grasp. The choice was there, right in front of him: accept the mysterious man's offer and gain control over the situation, or continue to fight on his own, knowing the battle would only get harder. His eyes flicked to his daughter, the fire of determination burning bright in her gaze. He knew deep down what he had to do. Before he could make a move, however, the officer blurted out, "You don't understand. You can't take me down. I have allies. I'm not the only one with power in this town." His voice shook, but there was a desperate edge to it. "If you think I'm going to fall this easily," the girl stepped forward, her face calm, her voice steady. "You've already lost." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. The officer's face paled. He had underestimated the resolve of this girl, this young woman who had been pushed to the edge. The same girl he had tried to break was now standing tall, ready to watch him crumble. The man in the suit laughed softly, but it was the kind of laugh that sent chills down the officer's spine. "Oh, you've underestimated everyone," he said, his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "The truth is, the power you thought you wielded, it's nothing compared to what's coming. The system you've been part of is crumbling, and you were never as untouchable as you believed." Suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut with an intense force, shaking the walls. The officer spun around, his heart pounding. Through the darkened glass, a silhouette could be seen: a figure in a long coat, moving with purposeful steps. The mysterious man in the suit turned to the new arrival, his smile fading. "You!" The man in the suit spat, his voice low with venom. "What are you doing here?" The figure stepped forward, the light catching their face. It was another officer only, This one carried an air of authority that made even the man in the suit pause. The new officer's eyes locked onto the officer who had been the cause of all this chaos. The tension in the room skyrocketed as everyone watched the standoff unfold. "I'm here to fix your mess," the new officer said, his voice cold but firm. "You thought you could bury the truth, that no one would notice. But it was only a matter of time before everything came to light. You were never in control. Not anymore." The officer who had shaved the girl's hair took a step back, his face turning red as he struggled to find his footing in this new, dangerous situation. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice cracking. The new officer turned his gaze to the girl's father, then to her. There was no pity in his eyes, just cold understanding. "I've been watching you for a long time. I know what's been happening here. And now, it's time to bring the truth to light." At that moment, the mysterious man in the suit moved forward, his hand reaching for something inside his jacket. The officer tensed, his hand instinctively going to his own weapon. But before either could make a move, the new officer spoke again, his words cutting through the growing tension. "Don't even think about it. This has gone far enough." And in that instant, everything changed. The man in the suit hesitated, and then he did the unthinkable. He lowered his hand, stepped back, and let out a long, frustrated sigh. "You really think you can take me down? You think your little game of justice will stop what's already been set in motion?" The girl's father remained quiet, his heart pounding in his chest. He had never expected this turn of events. His whole world had shifted in a matter of moments. But now, with the mysterious man and the new officer facing off, the feeling of dread had returned. He didn't know who to trust, who to believe. The new officer turned to him and said, "You don't have to be part of this. There's still a chance to do the right thing. Your daughter, she deserves justice. Don't let anyone stand in the way of that." The girl's father looked down at his daughter, her eyes filled with both defiance and hope. She had come this far, and now, it seemed, the path was opening up for them to finally see the justice they had been seeking. But just as he thought the situation was heading towards some form of resolution, the girl spoke again, her voice filled with a quiet yet deadly certainty. "I don't think justice is what we need," she said, her gaze steady. "We need something more." The room went silent as everyone turned to look at her, confusion spreading across the faces of the officers and the mysterious man. The girl's words hung in the air like a challenge, one that no one was prepared for. "I've learned a lot in these last few weeks," she continued, her voice unwavering. "Justice isn't just about what's right or wrong. It's about power and making sure that those who abuse it pay the price." "And the officer who wronged me?" She stepped forward, her eyes locked onto the officer who had dared to shave her head. "You think you'll just walk away unscathed? You think you'll just slip back into the shadows?" The officer's face twisted with fear as she approached, the realization dawning on him that he was about to lose everything. He had taken too much for granted, and now, there was no way out. "You're not walking away from this," the girl said, her voice cold, calculated. "I'm going to make sure everyone knows who you really are. I'm going to make sure your crimes come to light. And you'll never be able to hide behind your badge again." The room seemed to grow colder as the officer's world unraveled around him. The new officer, once a potential ally, now seemed like just another player in a game that no one truly understood. The mysterious man in the suit had been nothing more than a tool, a means to an end. The girl had turned the tables on them all, and she wasn't done yet. As the officer opened his mouth to protest, to beg for mercy, the door slammed open once more. This time, there was no mistaking the identity of the person who entered. It was a figure the officer had never expected to see, someone whose presence sent a shockwave through the room. The man's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "This ends now." And with that, the world the officer had known came crashing down around him. The girl had won. The room fell into a heavy silence as the figure who had entered the room stepped forward, his presence undeniable. The officer who had shaved the girl's hair couldn't believe his eyes. He had never expected this man to show up, let alone at this moment. His entire body went stiff as he realized the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just any officer, this was someone much higher up the ranks, someone who held the power to end his career with a single word. The girl's father took a step back, his breath caught in his throat. It was clear that he had been caught in the web of something far more complicated than he had originally thought. What had started as a simple attempt to get justice for his daughter had now spiraled into a confrontation that was about to change everything. He glanced at his daughter, who stood with quiet determination, her resolve unshaken by the sudden shift in the room's dynamics. "This ends now," the man said again, his voice low and authoritative. There was no mistaking the finality in his tone. He turned his gaze to the officer who had wronged the girl, his eyes filled with both disdain and anger. "You've crossed a line that you'll never be able to uncross. You thought you could get away with this, but you were wrong." The officer's face turned pale, and his hands trembled. He had no words left, no defense. All the power he once held had evaporated in an instant. It was over. The consequences of his actions were now catching up to him, and there was no way to escape them. The man in the suit, who had been watching from the sidelines, seemed to lose his confidence as well. He had thought he could manipulate the situation to his advantage, but now he understood that he was merely a pawn in a much larger game. The girl had turned everything upside down, and there was nothing left for him to do but watch the pieces fall into place. The new officer turned back to the girl and her father, offering them a rare, almost imperceptible nod of respect. "You did well," he said, his voice surprisingly soft. "This should never have happened, but now, we can make sure it never happens again. The system may have failed you once, but not anymore." The girl's father felt a wave of relief wash over him. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about seeing justice served, about knowing that no one else would have to endure what his daughter had gone through. His heart swelled with pride as he looked at her. She had shown incredible strength and courage in the face of adversity, and now, it seemed that her fight had finally paid off. The girl turned to her father, her expression softening just for a moment. It was the first time he had seen her truly at peace since the day the officer had shaved her hair. There was a quiet understanding between them, a bond forged in the fires of injustice, and now tempered by the promise of a brighter future. But just as the tension in the room began to ease, the officer who had been standing in the corner, seemingly forgotten, suddenly spoke up. "You think this is over? You think this is the end?" He sneered, his voice laced with venom. "You've only seen the tip of the iceberg. There's more coming, and you won't be able to stop it." The new officer didn't flinch. He had seen threats like this before. "There's always more coming," he replied calmly, "but that doesn't matter anymore. You had your chance. Now you'll face the consequences." The officer's face twisted with fury, but he knew better than to challenge the authority standing before him. With a final, bitter glance at the girl and her father, he turned and walked out of the room, leaving behind a trail of uncertainty and fear. As the door slammed shut, the room fell back into a silence that felt almost surreal. The girl's father looked at the new officer, his mind still reeling from the sudden turn of events. "What happens now?" he asked, his voice shaking slightly. The officer smiled, a small but reassuring gesture. "Now, we make sure that everyone involved faces the consequences. You'll have your justice, but it won't be easy. The system is broken, and it'll take time to fix it. But this is a start." The girl's father nodded, his heart heavy but hopeful. He had feared that nothing would ever be done, that his daughter's suffering would go unnoticed, but now there was a glimmer of hope. He glanced at his daughter once more, a sense of pride swelling in his chest. The girl, too, seemed to sense the shift in the atmosphere. Her eyes met her father's, and for the first time, she allowed herself to relax. She had fought for this moment, and now, it was finally here. She had taken on the system, and though the battle had been hard, she had emerged victorious. As the moments stretched on, the new officer began to speak again, this time addressing both of them. You won't be alone in this fight. There are others who care about what happened to your daughter, who want to see real change. This won't be easy, but together, we can make sure that no one else has to endure what you've been through. The girl nodded, a sense of determination returning to her. She had already gone through the worst of it, and now, she was ready to continue the fight not just for herself, but for others like her. For those who had been wronged, for those whose voices had been silenced. She wouldn't stop until things had changed. And with her father by her side, and the new officer's support, she knew that she could make a difference. As they stood together in that room, the weight of everything that had transpired over the past days, weeks, and months finally began to lift. The truth had come to light, and the officer who had wronged them was being held accountable. The battle wasn't over, but it had shifted. Now they had the upper hand, and they wouldn't let it go. And as the girl walked out of the room, her head held high, she couldn't help but reflect on everything she had endured to get to this point. She had faced down injustice and fought for what was right, even when the odds were stacked against her. Now, she was ready for whatever came next. Because no matter what, she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't going to let anyone take away her power or her voice. The story was far from over, but it had taken a turn towards something better. The road ahead would be challenging, but it was a road worth traveling. For the girl, for her father, and for everyone who had been overlooked or oppressed, change was finally on the horizon. And in that moment, it felt like the world was about to shift in their favor.